president of Environmental Perspectives. He talks about environmental issues and the role of the United Nations and its global environment. His remarks to the John Birch Society took place in January and last about an hour 10 minutes.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this evening's event. My name is Robert Willington, and before we begin, I would like to open with a prayer and then the pledge. To conduct the prayer, I would like to introduce Pastor Daniels, a chapter leader from Limerick, Maine. Pastor?
Let us all look to the Lord in prayer. Father, we come to you tonight thanking you for the world in which we live. We thank you that you have given us a resilient earth. And we would pray, Lord, for those who would seek to erode freedoms bit by bit, piece by piece, statute by statute, law by law. Lord, we ask if they use the guise of environmentalism, as we will hear about tonight, that you would cause us and many like us around this dear country to put a stop to that. We ask, Lord, that you might give us the knowledge and education that we need tonight to better combat the lies that are being told and expressed in the press and in the news, in any news media, and in our colleges and universities, that you might give us more education tonight in which we can go out and be better armed and equipped to handle that would war against the founding of this country and the freedoms that we have so wonderfully enjoyed in the last 200 years. We pray, Lord, tonight for the speaker. We ask your blessing upon him and upon us this evening, for we ask it in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ, our Savior. Amen.
Will you please stand for the pledge? I pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. Before I begin, I'd like to mention that after the speech tonight, there will not be a question and answer period, but if you would like to chat with Dr. Coffman, feel free to do so at the information booth. John Birch Society, through its summer program, the Robert Welch University. 3 consecutive years, and it was there, not in the public schools, where I learned American constitutionalism. The John Birch Society was founded in 1958 by the late Robert Welch. The society was named after John Birch, who was a courageous Baptist missionary killed by the communists in China. The John Birch Society is an educational organization that is committed to preserving the Constitution. Today, the John Birch Society has local chapters in all 50 states. The tools we use to communicate limited government, traditional values, and individual responsibility are the highly respected New American Magazine, our webpage, the Trim Bulletin, and the summer camps across the country. Through the action of its members, who help to shape public opinion, the John Birch Society has contributed to exposure of tax and spend politicians, exposed federal plans to take over local law enforcement, repudiate pro-world governmental initiatives, stopped dangerous pieces of legislation that would have eroded constitutionally protected God-given rights, and much more. The society effectively impacts public policy because we possess the ultimate weapon, the truth. We understand that education is only effective through action. Tonight is just one example of how our organization sponsors effective speakers that enlighten the public. Together with less government, more responsibility, and with God's help, we can create a better America. And now, it is my great honor to introduce to you the New England coordinator to the John Birch Society, Mr. Harold Shurtleff.
Before I introduce our speaker, I just have a few things to mention. all the information in the world is useless without the tools to make it available to other people. The information you're going to get tonight will really not have a lot of impact unless you take the material with you and go out and help educate others, and that's our mission. I want to recommend a few things that we have on the information table. One of them is Dr. Coffman's book, Saviors of the Earth. It's a fantastic book, something that needs to be read. It should be in every public school in the country. A couple of books that we publish on the UN. One of them is entitled Freedom on the Altar by Will Grigg. It goes into the UN's crusade against God and family from a spiritual perspective. And then Changing Commands by Mr. John McManus, the John Birch Society's president. This goes into the military aspect and the plans to take our military and put it into the hands of the UN. Then we have, of course, our New American magazine, and we have several issues which I want to highlight to you. One of them is the global warming issue that came out a little while ago. There's some real scientists that refute the claims made by the environmentalists that we have global warming. Then I call it the granddaddy of all New Americans. It's our conspiracy issue. We have thousands of these in circulation around the country, and this really gets you a good understanding of what's going on behind the scenes, and it's really vital information. Then I have a reprint, since this particular issue of the magazine was out of print, an article written by Dr. Coffman called Globalized Grizzlies, and he's going to be talking a lot about this subject, not so much grizzlies, but more how they're being globalized. Dr. Michael Coffman is a PhD in environmental science. He's a graduate of Idaho State, and he's author of numerous books. He lectures around the country. He's a founder of Environmental Perspective, and this is a full-time basis. He does this on a full-time basis. He lectures around the country, radio shows, talk shows, and he's able to inform thousands, perhaps millions of Americans who have been really in the dark about this subject. He has been on 2 speakers tours for the John Birch Society, and he's a glutton for punishment because he's going on a 3rd out in March and April. So let's give him a warm welcome, Dr. Coffman.
Well, thank you. It's a very big pleasure for me to be here tonight. I always enjoy coming down to this part of the country. I have family down here. My son lives just outside of Worcester, and that's where I'm going to be going tonight. So there's always an incentive for me to come down and enjoy what you have to offer here. I'm going to launch more or less right into the discussion, since we are going to be somewhat limited on time tonight, and start out by explaining what I'm going to be talking about tonight, and then explaining more in depth what this means to you and every other one of our American fellows. I was in the forest products industry. I've taught about half of my professional career, conducted research in ecosystems management, classification, and so have published books in this particular area, as well as worked for the forest products industry, heading up an international program on the effects of acid rain and global climate change on our nation's forests, working with Canada, the U.S. Forest Service, and the Environmental Protection Agency to conduct what amounted to, over the 1980s, about little over $500 million worth of research on the impacts of these particular threats to our nation's forests. And it was because the forest products industry, the paper industry, was so concerned about this issue. Very often we look at that particular industry and think that they don't care, but you have to recognize that the forest are the raw materials, and therefore they are very concerned about what happens to our nation's forest and take every effort to have the best management and stewardship possible within that context. And what we had found with this $500 million worth of research during the 1980s with the National Acid Precipitation Assessment Program was that, yes, acid rain existed, and yes, it was causing some problems, but not that much of a problem, and certainly not to the extent that was being proclaimed by the environmentalists and the popular media. It was the Clean Air Act, the reauthorization of the Clean Air Act in 1990, that tipped me off that there was something terribly, terribly wrong. And that particular reauthorization process, the reports had been written, this $500 million worth of research had been summarized for congressional review. And in the congressional process, it was totally ignored. Absolutely and totally ignored. In other words, we had just done 10 years of research for absolutely no reason whatsoever. because the only thing that was considered within the halls of Congress was hyperbole, rhetoric, and emotionalism generated by environmental leadership. And my conversations tonight are going to be focused on primarily environmental leadership. I'm not talking about environmentalists. I think all of us are concerned about our environment. All of us want clean air and clean water, healthy forests, healthy ecosystems. The question is, what is it that environmental leadership is doing? Because people that actually work for the Sierra Club, National Audubon, and so forth are often there for the right reasons, but they've been getting bad information, again, by their leadership. And when I realized what was going on and began to investigate really what the goals were of environmental leadership that led into the international agenda, it became very clear to me very quickly that environmental leadership really did not care one bit, and this is a very strong statement. They do not care about protecting the environment. They do not care about protecting the environment. They are using the environment as a Trojan horse or a straw horse as a surrogate issue for justifying the need for global government. And I will explain more what that means as we go through this next hour. The topic tonight is going to be on how the environment is being utilized in the global governance process. I'm going to be using some documents from the United Nations that show what their plans are right now to create a world government by the year 2000. These are actually published documents. They're available for anyone to review. You don't have to be a rocket scientist or a sleuth to find them. They're posted on the internet. I'll be talking about two primary treaties. The Convention on Climate Change, that was just a big issue in the media a month ago in Kyoto, Japan. And I'll also be talking about the Convention on Biological Diversity, which we are very proud that we had a direct hand. There's 4 of us that almost single-handedly stopped that from being ratified in the U.S. Senate 1 hour before the cloture vote was scheduled to be taken on September 30th, 1994. I'll explain what these treaties would mean to you and I and all other fellow Americans, and how these could be utilized then to create the world government that they're planning to implement through a change in the United Nations Charter in the year 2000. Well, what is involved here is primarily an effort that's outlined in this book called Our Global Neighborhood. This particular book was published by the Commission on Global Governance, which was funded by the United Nations, published in 1995, and it outlines a series of recommendations as to how to create global governance through the United Nations. Again, this is available on the internet, or you can buy it from Oxford University Press for $14.95. And especially the last chapter outlines in detail the recommendations as to how to create a world government through the charter changes and so forth that would be necessary. We'll be talking a little bit about this tonight, but more specifically, what I would like to talk about is what the United Nations is actually doing in its reform process. Because on July 16th of this last summer, 1997, Secretary General Kofi Annan announced in a press conference a major and fundamental restructuring of the United Nations that was going to overhaul the United Nations from top to bottom and create a United Nations better suited to meet the world needs in the 21st century, according to our Secretary General. And the key that I want to really emphasize here today, I'll be talking about a number of things that are being discussed and they're actually being implemented today. I won't touch on all of them, but I'll touch on a few critical ones, because what he made very clear was, one, in the year 2000 there will be a Millennium Assembly. A Millennium Assembly in which all the heads of nations will be brought together in New York to discuss, one, the future of the United Nations, and two, the necessary charter changes to make the United Nations more effective in serving humanity in the 21st century. In order to be prepared for that, he has created a separate organization in which will study the recommendations from our global neighborhood and have the necessary changes to the United Nations Charter, therefore, the various heads of state to sign in the year 2000 during the Millennium Assembly. Secondly, he is calling for a new branch of the United Nations called the People's Assembly. The People's Assembly would be created and would be parallel to the General Assembly. He would also expand the Security Council. He would like to begin the process of taking out the 5 permanent members of the Security Council and taking away the veto power of those 5 permanent members. The People's Assembly, according to our Secretary General Kofi Annan's comments, there would be staffed primarily, staffed primarily by what is known as civil society in UN jargon. Civil society, again, in UN jargon, is made up of non-governmental organizations, are called NGOs. And of course, non-governmental organizations are those accredited groups that are not government related. They would be, for instance, the Sierra Club, the World Wildlife Fund for Nature, the World Socialist Party, the Planetary Citizens, and all of the socialist-oriented New Age environmental and socialist organizations in the world. In other words, the new People's Assembly would be made up of non-governmental organizations, not elected by you or I, but selected and appointed to represent us within the People's Assembly. And again, you don't have to take my word for it. You can go to the United Nations webpage, www.un.org/reform. Go to the Track 2 set of documents and read it for yourself. This is all being planned. Have you heard about this in your evening news? No. Have you read about it in the Boston Globe? No. And yet, it is a move on the part, what I call the internationalists, that will begin to take control over our lives. Because the United Nations, by establishing the People's Assembly and the General Assembly and taking away the veto power of the Security Council, creating a United Nations military force and disarming all of the rest of the world, these are all proposals that are being considered and implemented right now, would become the world government. Now, they're calling it global governance. You're going to start hearing a lot about global governance over the next 2 years. But folks, they will put this in very rosy context, and what they will begin to say is because we have such tremendous international problems, especially in the area of the environment, such as global warming, ozone depletion, ecosystem destruction, all of which cross international boundaries, that we must have the authority through international treaties to begin to bring nations together to find solutions. That's how they will phrase and couch the language that they will use. But beware. Always look for how they're going to be held accountable. And right now, what's being proposed, this could change, of course, in the next 2 years, but right now, what's being proposed, there is absolutely no accountability whatsoever to the peoples of the world. The United Nations would have absolute power over our lives with no avenue for redress on our part of any meaningful context. It's a very serious issue, and it's only 2 years away, and we're not hearing anything about it. One of the things that Secretary General Kofi Annan said in his press conference is that to make global governance work, the United Nations must, and I quote, make non-governmental organizations key operational partners and implementing agents of the United Nations. A vibrant civil society, he says, is critical to the processes of democratization and empowerment. And you're going to hear a lot about this context, too, of the new democracy, global democracy. It's not a democracy. We will not have a vote as private citizens, nor will our fellow world citizens. The democratization is within the non-governmental organization community called civil society, non-elective. And we must be aware of what they're trying to do if we're going to make our neighbors, our communities, and this country aware of what the United Nations is planning to do in the year 2000 so that we can begin to stop this process. Tragically, our Vice President has also begun the process of promoting the very same agenda. In his book, Earth in the Balance, our Vice President, Albert Gore, states this. He says, "I believe that civilization, our civilization, is in effect addicted to the consumption of the world itself." That's a pretty outrageous statement when you get to thinking about it. He goes on to say that he believes that our society is dysfunctional, that we cannot tell what right is from wrong. And as a consequence, we must, he says, the froth and the frenzy of industrialized civilization mask our deep loneliness for that communion with the world that can lift our spirits and fill our senses with the richness and the immediacy of life itself. He continues by saying that we must make the rescue of the global environment, or the earth, the central organizing principle for civilization. This means, he says, using every policy and strategy, every law and institution, every treaty and alliance, every tactic and strategy, every plan and course of action to halt the ecological destruction of the environment and to preserve and nurture our ecological systems. Minor shifts, he says, in policy, marginal adjustments in ongoing programs, moderate improvements in laws and regulations, rhetoric offered in lieu of genuine change. These are all forms of appeasement designed to satisfy the public's desire to believe that sacrifice, struggle, and a wrenching transformation of society will not be necessary. This from our Vice President, who was one heartbeat away from becoming president and may shortly become president. And he says that we are dysfunctional and therefore is calling us as American citizens to suffer and to sacrifice in a wrenching transformation of society that he is creating. And not one word in the popular media. Not one word. It's all there for everybody to read. All you have to do is check out the book in the library and read it for yourself. Now, if in fact our Vice President is right, and we are destroying the ecosystems of the world, that we do have global warming that will cause a 3 to 7 degree increase in temperature, global temperatures that will melt the polar ice caps and flood our coastal cities and islands and so forth, then maybe a wrenching transformation in society would be appropriate and necessary. But the fact is that on an issue such as global warming, in spite of what the White House is telling us, in spite of what the United Nations is telling us, there is no evidence whatsoever that we are having global warming. Nor is there any scientific evidence, according to the report of 2,500 scientists in the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, that we are affecting climate change at all. We are having climate change. The Earth has always had climate change. It always will have climate change. The Earth's climate is always changing. But these 2,500 scientists have proclaimed that there is no scientific evidence from all the research that has been conducted over the last 10 years to suggest that mankind is causing any of this. And yet the report that these 2,500 scientists actually wrote and very carefully wordsmithed to make sure they said what they wanted to say, submitted it to the United Nations, Whereupon the lead author, Dr. Santor, systematically went through, at the request of the United Nations, the United States State Department, and others around the world, non-governmental organizations, and deleted or changed every single statement that proclaimed there is no scientific evidence that we're having global warming, nor is man causing climate change. Deleted or changed every single reference throughout 18 pages of the scientific summary, thereby leading or allowing the United Nations in the executive summary to proclaim that there is now a scientific consensus that there is a link between man's activity and global climate change and global warming. And of course, this is what the New York Times, the CBS Evening News, and all of the media have to go on, is basically the executive summary. They do not see the original report that was written by the scientists. And what the United Nations has done is falsified the scientific report to promote a specific agenda. It can be looked at in no other way. And right now, within the scientific community, this is a hot potato beyond anything belief. And you do not see anything about this roaring controversy going on within the scientific community at all within the popular media. The actual temperature record, the best scientific evidence that we have, comes from a series of 6 satellites that have been up since 1979 that can measure the temperature of the Earth very, very accurately to 0.01 degrees centigrade. Any latitude, longitude, and elevation above the Earth's surface. It's all combined in a supercomputer or split out however a scientist wants to look at it and review it, and summarized on an hourly, daily, monthly, yearly basis, whatever they would like to do. And what that data shows, very, very clearly again, and we have some handouts in the back that are free, you can take them home, that show this data curve, is that we have not experienced global warming since the 1979 period when these satellites were launched. We've experienced global cooling, just exactly the opposite of what the political agenda and the popular belief truly is. Now, it hasn't been an extreme amount of global cooling over the 20-year period that these satellites have been up. It's only gone down by 0.021 degrees centigrade. Nothing to get real excited about, except that the global models say that during the same 20-year period, it should have gone up by about 1/3 of a degree. But it's gone down. The global models don't work. The last 10 years, since the late 1980s, when the temperature did peak, the temperature has actually declined by almost a full 1/3 of a degree. Now, is that anything to get excited about? Are we entering the next ice age? Probably not, although we're due geologically to enter the next ice age. But the Earth's temperature is on a 11-year cycle. It's very closely related to the sunspot activity, which in turn is related to the solar energy output. And if you combine the solar energy output along with the Earth's rotation and the position of Earth relative to the sun, it explains over 90% of the variation of the Earth's temperature over the last couple hundred years. In other words, we're not experiencing anything differently than what would be normally expected given the energy output of the sun and the position of the Earth relative to the sun. The scenes that you saw in December of 1997 on your evening news of glaciers in retreat was taken of a glacier in Alaska that has a history on a 15-year cycle of advancing and retreating. Right now it's in a retreat mode. The temperatures in that portion of Alaska over the last 20 years have been colder than they have the previous 70 years. So how could global warming be affecting or causing that retreat? And many of you who are old enough remember that in the mid-1980s, late 1980s, you saw every night on the evening news how this very same glacier had advanced so rapidly, it was advancing 100 yards a day, and had literally come down to the ocean and sealed off a bay, trapping 7 whales within the bay. They couldn't get out. And they were afraid they were going to starve to death because they didn't have the food supply in that bay to last them. Do you remember that? It's the very same glacier. Now it's in retreat. Why? Because as it pushed forward, it moved down into an area just too warm. And now it's retreating. And it's also building up more ice at its headwaters, or head ice, I don't know what it's called, but up where it starts. And pretty soon it's going to start advancing again. And yet you were led to believe in December of 1997 by the popular media that this is evidence of global warming. And it's nothing more than a natural phenomenon. In fact, 55% of the glaciers and the ice caps in the world are now growing rather than retreating. The evidence is there have been several research projects over the last 2 years to define whether or not we're having more extreme climatic events and if there are more of them, and they're not. The climate isn't any more extreme now than it was 60 years ago. Nor are we having more extreme events than we had 60 years ago. We're having some more extreme events than we did 20 years ago because for the 1960, 70, and 80 period, we had a lull in the climatic regime of the Earth that we did not have as many extreme storms. But compared to 60 years ago when we had no greenhouse gas emissions and so forth, it's the same today as it was then. We're not having global warming. And yet, over the last year and a half, as the Executive Director of Sovereignty International, we have had representation in Germany and in Switzerland during the negotiating sessions of the Climate Change Convention that was in Kyoto this past December. With the assumption of all those who are present that global warming is occurring. And there was not a consensus, there was not anything that was agreed to during that period of a year and a half by the various nation states. And in fact, when it came out that there was a scientific consensus that we were having an effect on climate, our organization addressed and challenged on the floor Secretary Michael Kudahar, the Secretary of the Climate Change Convention, as to how he arrived at his decision that the consensus had been reached, that there is a discernible effect of human effects on climate change. His response, he says, consensus is not unanimity. Consensus is what the president says it is. In other words, it's what he decides it's going to be at any time he decides it's going to be it. That's how the United Nations works. This is our future, folks. If they're able to get the charter changes through that are necessary to make it into a world government. And just because they call it global governance, don't let that fool you. Government under any other name is still government. And in this case, it's a totally non-elective form of government with incredible powers over our lives. When you consider that the Convention on Climate Change, the Convention on Biological Diversity, the Convention on Discrimination against women, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, the Convention on Desertification, the Convention on Sustainable Development, and the Convention on this and the Convention on that, when you put all of those together and you look at what they require, the various nation states, is that we will no longer have our sovereignty. Our decisions will literally be made by United Nations representatives. And they will literally control everything. And I want to repeat this. This is a bold statement, I recognize. But you have to understand these treaties, the magnitude of how they intrude into our lives, to fully put it together and see how each treaty feeds on each other and integrates into an interlocking set of international laws that literally control everything that we do. Everything. And I'll give some more specific examples of that in just a moment. This Climate Change Convention is based on the predication that we are experiencing global warming, when in fact we're not. Will require an increase, this is the absolute conservative minimum, of nearly 50% in gasoline prices natural gas prices by 150% increases, coal prices by over 600% increases, decrease in the gross national product of nearly 3% per year, a decrease in consumption by almost 4% per year, real wages by 4%, and the job loss of well over 2.5 million jobs in the United States. Why? Because the developing nations will not be bound by this protocol at all. Only the 36 developed nations will be affected by this protocol, the United States being the hardest hit. The 131 developing nations will be scot-free. So therefore, Mexico, China, Brazil, Hong Kong, well, it's part of China now, all of these nations will be totally exempt and continue to increase their emissions of greenhouse gases as much as they want. And in fact, the actual Energy Department has done a study in which they believe that up to 60% of our manufacturing and industrial capability will be forced to move offshore to these developing nations in order to stay in the business. By 7% reduction in below 1990 levels that the United States is going to be required to do, translates in, when you project what our energy requirements are going to be in the year 2010, when this all takes effect, require a 41% reduction in the emissions of fossil or greenhouse gases and therefore the use of fossil fuels. That's a 41% reduction in the use of your home appliances, the use of your automobile, the use of all your home air conditioning or home heating. It's going to have a major, major impact. And ironically, because the developing nations will not be affected at all, we will not reduce the total global emission rates at all. In fact, they will continue to rise. Because right now, within a couple of years, the total amount of emissions from the developing nations will greatly exceed that of the developed nations. And since they are not bound by the provisions of this, it will just continue to go up and up and up. This treaty will not do a single thing, even if it was important that we reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and of course it's not. There is no harm in waiting to see what science really shows through studies over the next several years. In short, the false environmental holocausts that have been created by the United Nations and some of the international community are being used to justify the need for global governance. There have been 3 non-governmental organizations that are primarily and principally involved in this: the World Resources Institute, the World Wildlife Fund for Nature, and one that we're all familiar with, the IUCN, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. And I'll dare say that if there's one person in the audience that has ever even heard of that name, you'd be surprised. I'd be surprised. And yet the IUCN, almost single-handedly, it is a granddaddy of all non-governmental organizations. Created in 1946 to be the scientific advisor for the United Nations, made up of governmental scientists from around the world, it has actually done some good during its first half of its life. But in 1972, a man by the name of Maurice Strong, who became its director, split the IUCN into 2 groups. One is the scientific side and the other is the non-governmental organization side. And now the IUCN is made up of 700 non-governmental organizations and 170 governmental organizations, totally dominated by organizations like the Sierra Club, Nature Conservancy, National Audubon, the NRDC, Natural Resources Defense Council, and so forth. And let me just read to you the role of the IUCN. This is right from its web page off the internet. The IUCN, quote, promotes alternative models for sustainable communities and lifestyles based in eco-spiritual practices and principles. Wait a minute, what is eco-spiritual practices and principles? The problems that face, it continues, the world today, humanity must undergo a radical change in its attitudes, behavior, and values. In response to this situation, a new global ethics is taking form and is finding its expression in international law. The IUCN is, in essence, behind it all. And behind the IUCN and the whole effort is a fellow by the name of Maurice Strong, and I'm not going to be able to, unfortunately, get into much discussion. Maurice Strong was the first Secretary General of the first Earth Summit in Stockholm in 1972 that led to the creation of UNEP, of which he became the first director in 1972, the same time he was serving in the IUCN. His list of accomplishments would take us all evening to get through. This is a very brilliant man. He was on the Brundtland Commission on Sustainable Development, the United Nations group that defined what sustainable development should be. He was on the Commission on Global Governance that wrote this book, and he had a principal hand in writing it. He was the second Secretary General of the Second Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro in 1992. And most of the treaties that came out of that particular effort, and Agenda-21, which is soft law, was crafted after his desires. He formed what is known as the Earth Council to implement Agenda-21, the Convention on Biological Diversity, and so forth, and has collaborated with Green Cross, who was led by Mikhail Gorbachev over the last 2 years, to write what is known as the Earth Charter. And the Earth Charter establishes a set of pantheistic, the belief that nature is God, ethics that they want the United Nations to ratify as the guiding principle and the qualifications necessary to hold leadership position after the United Nations becomes the world government in the year 2000, according to this document right here. The Earth Charter starts out by saying that the Earth is alive, and they truly mean it. Many within this belief system truly believe that the Earth is a sentient being, the Earth goddess Gaia. I'm not saying this to denigrate what these folks believe in, because all of us have our right to believe what we want to have or want to believe in this nation, and I strongly support that. But unless you understand that what they believe will destroy you, your families, your neighbors, your communities, and the United States of America as we know it today, it will not be fair, because you will not understand why they're doing the things that they're doing. The IUCN has basically come up with a definition that is very, very new age in its expression for what sustainable development really is. And this is the pattern after which all of the international treaties are based. The IUCN has said that sustainable by definition not only means indefinitely prolonged, but also nourishing, as the earth is nourishing to life and the self-actualization of persons and communities. And I want you to remember the word communities. The word development need not be restricted to economic activity, but can mean the evolution. The evolution, the word in evolution is to them the same thing as reincarnation. The two are equivalent. And again, I'm not here saying that to denigrate what they believe, but you have to understand why they believe it to understand what I'm going to read you out of another United Nations document in a moment. The unfolding, the growth, and the fulfillment of any and all aspects of life on Earth. Thus, sustainable development may be defined as the kind of human activity that nourishes and perpetuates the fulfillment of the entire Earth community and life on Earth. That is the definition of sustainable development that's the driving force behind Agenda-21, behind the Convention on Biological Diversity, the Convention on Climate Change, and so forth. The IUCN has actually coined a new expression called biocentrism, the philosophy of biocentrism, where all life has equal intrinsic value, because they truly believe that God is nature, nature is God, therefore everything is equal, has equal intrinsic value. Now, where does this lead us politically? What that means is that if mankind benefits through its legal system at the expense of nature, then these are bad laws and must be changed. And what we have literally seen over the last 30 years is an assault on our economic system and our legal system to change laws to bring more into balance the equality between man and nature. Can't deny it. That's exactly what's been happening in the last 30 years. And when that new law, or those new sets of laws, also benefit man at the expense of nature, because they must, as long as there is one human being left on Earth, we have to benefit at the expense of nature, then that law is bad. And you begin to see a pattern here, what's called nihilism. the loss of hope. The only hope is the elimination of mankind itself. And that has led certain environmentalists to believe that man is the cancer on the face of the earth. Not all of them, certainly not all of them, but some of the leaders. Jacques Cousteau, for instance, in UNESCO documents, has proclaimed that the only hope for the world, in saving the world, is the elimination of 350,000 human beings a day. And you will actually see this being recommended in the Convention on Biological Diversity in a moment. Now, I had been tracking the IUCN for a number of years. As a scientist, I have a PhD in ecosystems analysis. I've been working in this field for over 20 years. And wondering where all of this was coming from. Because it was the IUCN that wrote the Convention on Biological Diversity. It was the IUCN that had a hand and played a key role in writing the Framework Convention on Climate Change. It was the IUCN that right now is writing the Convention on Sustainable Development. It was the IUCN that led the effort to write the Convention on Desertification, and so forth. They are at the heart of all that we're seeing right now. Well, who is this IUCN? Not only is it the Sierra Club, Nature Conservancy, National Audubon, and so forth, but it's also the Federal Environmental Protection Agency, the U.S. National Park Service, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, NOAA, the U.S. Forest Service. All of the federal land management agencies are those agencies having responsibility for land management regulation in the United States. And what this has allowed them to do is to systematically, behind closed doors, which would be illegal within the United States, that our federal agencies are able to sit down at the same table with these non-governmental organizations such as the Sierra Club and develop their eco-spiritual agendas and strategies to implement on the American people. And we have actual documentation out of the Environmental Protection Agency that states that their primary objective, starting in 1993, is not to serve the people of the United States, but fundamentally to meet, to implement, to be responsible in implementing the international agenda. It says that very clearly in these in-house